Okay, hi. So we're back, and in the last PowerPoint, we left off with Ho Chi Minh writing many letters to President Truman, asking if the U.S. would help support Vietnam to become independent at the end of the war, and today we're going to talk about what the U.S. does and how they get involved. So, how does the U.S. respond? Well, first of all, the U.S. ignores his letters and his pleas and decides that Vietnam should go back to being a colony of France. And you have to remember the U.S. is very powerful. They had just won World War II. They're at the top of their game, but they also have this enemy, which is the Soviet Union, this communist force. And there are many reasons the U.S. decides not to give Vietnam back. And also England. They're also working with England and other European allies. One of the big reasons is most likely because France, European allies need France on their side, and they don't want to make France angry, and they want to give what France wants, so that France will, be on their side in this new kind of splitting up of world powers. French business leaders are also worried that if they don't have Vietnam back, their economy will get really bad, and it's already horrible and devastated because of the war, and people are already striking and supporting unions and supporting socialist and communist parties. And so France leaders are really worried that not having the colony of France will turn France itself into a communist country. So there are a lot of reasons why this happens. And sorry, I meant to say, and the U.S. doesn't want France to become communist either. So lots of reasons why, but the end result is that Ho Chi Minh does not get independence for Vietnam and has to give Vietnam back to France after making a declaration of Vietnamese independence. Howard Zinn writes, he's a great historian, and he wrote this great book. I recommend everyone to read it. It's called A People's History of the United States. And in it, he talks about the Vietnam War, and he asks this question about this decision that was made at this time. He asks, was the United States fighting World War II to end the control by some nations over other nations, or to make sure the controlling nations were friends of the United States? So think about that. What does he mean by that? The United States fought in World War II because you had one nation taking over many other nations. The Nazis were taking over all these other countries in Europe. The Japanese military leaders were taking over all these other countries in Asia. And World War II was said to be fought for freedom, so people could choose their own leader, so they wouldn't be taken over by somebody else. And then here, the wars ended, and there's all this talk of freedom and people choosing their own leaders, and Vietnam is not given that. And so Howard Zinn is asking, why? What does the U.S. want here? Do they really care about countries having freedom, or are they more interested in their own power and sort of staying on top and having the friends that they want? So that's an interesting question to think about. Now Ho Chi Minh cannot turn to the U.S. So who do you think he's going to end up turning to if he's ignored from the U.S. and the European allies? I'll let you go ahead and guess. Think for a second, and now I will tell you. So if you guessed oops, did I miss a slide? If you guessed the Soviet Union and the communists, oh, never mind, I guess I don't have that slide. If you guessed the Soviet Union and the communists, you were correct. He ends up getting support from the Soviets, and then later also from China. In 1949, China becomes communist. And he goes to war against France. And the Vietnamese who support Ho Chi Minh are mainly many peasants. Peasants were not treated well under the French, and they formed guerrilla troops for Ho Chi Minh. And with the support of the Soviets and later China, they're given money and weapons, so they end up getting the upper hand over France. They know the land, the people support them. France actually is being funded by the United States. By 1953, 80% of the weapons and the money that France is using to fight against the Vietnamese come from the United States. So it's really not a war between France and Vietnam. It's really an international war. And this is really the first Vietnam War between France and the U.S. and the Soviets and China and the United States. years of fighting, very bloody war, and this is sort of this sad kind of moment in history when you think about how if only the U.S. and the European allies had not ignored Vietnam, perhaps Vietnam would not have turned over to the Soviets for help. And because remember, Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist first and a communist second, perhaps all of these wars could have been prevented. But this is history, and you can't think like that. That happened, and so it's good to think about this for the future to prevent future wars. But at that time, that wasn't a decision that was made, and years of bloody war happened. The war eventually ended in 1954 because France gave up. They just decided to cut their losses and leave. They had lost a lot of lives, and in 1954 there was a huge battle at Dien Bien Phu in the north of Vietnam, and France lost this battle, lost many lives, and they said, "Okay, that's it, we're out." Now, Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh were really excited. They thought finally we're going to get independence. We finally beat the French. This is finally our moment. Well, everybody meets in 1954 in Geneva to have a conference to decide, what should be done. And the decision that's made in Geneva is that Vietnam will be split up, and the North will go to Ho Chi Minh and the communists and people who support him, and the South will go to an independent government. And then in 2 years, everyone will vote and decide who they want to be the leaders of Vietnam. Now, when I say independent government, the reason I have it in quotes here is because really the government that's put into place in the South is a puppet government. And think about the word puppet. It means, you see a face, but really the face isn't doing the talking. It's someone from behind. And that's what it is. It's a South Vietnamese leader who's really being supported by the United States. The United States is kind of calling the shots and giving the money and backing up the South Vietnamese leader. And the South Vietnamese leader that they choose is, wealthy, supports business leaders, Catholic, because a lot of the Vietnamese who benefited under French colonialism, who were wealthy, and they converted to Catholicism like the French, because before the French came, Vietnamese were Buddhist. But so you had this kind of wealthy elite class, kind of the landlords who sort of worked with France when they were colonizing the Vietnamese, and now they're working with the U.S. And so it's sort of this kind of continuation of the same leaders. Why does the U.S. do all this? I mean, you really have to understand that the United States is the viewpoint that they have at this time. This is the early 1950s. This is the Cold War is at its height here, and there's this idea that communism is a monolithic force and it must be stopped at all costs. And there's this idea that the Soviets want to take over the world, they're commanding anyone, and any communist anywhere must be being told what to do by the Soviets. Well, we now know that this really wasn't the way it worked, but at the time this is what we thought what was going on. And President Eisenhower, who was the president at the time, coined the theory, domino theory, which is just like you see in this picture here, this idea that when one country becomes communist, another one will become communist, and just like dominoes, they'll all fall. So in 1949, China became communist, and then North Korea became communist, and then they fought to get South Korea to be communist. So in the early 50s, this war is going on in Korea to keep South Vietnam from, to keep South Korea from not becoming communist, and the U.S. is involved there. Now the Vietnamese are communist, and they've won against the French, and now what does this mean for the following countries? And if you follow the logic of the domino theory, you can see that eventually, it's coming from country to country, it's going to leave Southeast Asia and move on. Eventually it's going to get to the U.S., and eventually the U.S. is going to become communist, and they will lose their freedom. So really, in the early 50s, this is the mindset. So when France loses, the reason why the United States steps in and says, okay, wait, this can't happen, is because they are so worried about this communist threat. And Ho Chi Minh won, and he absolutely could have said, no, we're not going to take this. We want all of Vietnam. We're not going to be split up. But, Ho Chi Minh was worried that the U.S. was going to step in and start fighting. And he was hoping that by making this compromise and saying, okay, we'll wait 2 years for an election, that that in 2 years the elections would happen, and he knew people supported him and people would vote for him, and then all of Vietnam would be one country again. And so this was the hope. And a lot of people were upset and said, oh, we should get all of Vietnam, we did win against the French. And he said, okay, let's just wait 2 more years. We waited this long, we fought this long, we can wait 2 more years. So 2 years go by and there are no elections. And then, so 2 years from 1954 is 1956, and now 1957, and now 1958. And the years go by and there are no elections. Why are there no elections? They just don't happen, and nobody fights for the elections. President Eisenhower is quoted as saying that the reason why they didn't hold elections is because Ho Chi Minh is a dictator, and everyone knows that under a dictator, people don't have the right to vote, that they will force people to vote for who they want, and they will tell people they'll harm them if they don't. And so President Eisenhower says the elections are going to be rigged. So why have the elections? Everyone will vote for Ho Chi Minh, and it won't be a fair election. So there are no elections. Years go by, and soon this puppet government in the South starts to become very unpopular. People are not happy with the government. They never had a chance to vote to keep this government or not. The government was kind of propped up in 1954 very quickly by the U.S. government, and they're not doing a great job. And you're going to see opposition by Southern Vietnamese who are not happy with the government, and you're going to see the North start to get unhappy because the elections never happened. So I'm going to stop here and leave with this question of, what's going to happen? No elections, is the North going to stay North Vietnam and the South is going to stay South Vietnam? What's going to happen to the government? Is there going to be a war? One more thing to just add is that this shows you that Vietnam was never a North and South. They were one country. They were split up in 1954. So this idea of these two different countries is very new. All right, I'll see you in the next PowerPoint, and we'll answer these questions.